je suis présentement professeur adjoint au Concordia dans le département de sociologie et anthropologie. Aujourd'hui, désolé, je vais parler en anglais pour la plupart. C'est plus facile pour moi, mais je veux dire que s'il y a quelques questions, n'hésite pas de me demander. So today I'll be presenting a talk called Participatory Disease Surveillance, Digital Developments and Dilemmas. Before I get started, I'd like to just acknowledge the work of my collaborators in what I'm about to present. So the talk that I'm going to give today is drawn mainly from a piece I've written with my colleague, Dr. Baki Shakuji, with the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths in London. It also draws from a long-standing collaboration that I've had with one of my mentors, Dr. Eric Mikolovsky at York University, and now also one of my graduate students, a great grad student that I'm working with, Carmen Lamont, and this is a project that looks at public health intelligence. And additionally, though in a bit more of a peripheral way, it draws from or it's informed at least by an ongoing collaboration that I have with some colleagues from Europe and the UK, the goal of which is to try and examine developments in digital epidemiology. And I'd also finally like to acknowledge one of my RAs, Miriam Tardif, who is helping me with some translation of this material, some of this material for the TIC Santé website. So, here's basically what I'd like to cover today. I'll start with some remarks that draw a distinction between population-focused and event-focused health monitoring. And a lot of my discussion is going to hang on this distinction. It's maybe, we can trouble how rigid this distinction is, but it's a heuristic device for me, a way into this topic. I'll spend the majority of time presenting the event as a key active concept. And I'm going to try and consider also the forms of knowledge, diverse informants, and organizational initiatives, some of these anyway, that this discursive configuration of public health problems presupposes. And it's within this framework that I'll talk about participatory surveillance, along with some of the opportunities and dilemmas that I think this emergent mode of surveillance presents. It's a fascinating space, and I can only touch on some of it, and hopefully I'll talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we can open up a discussion more generally about this. But as I mentioned, if there are questions as I'm going along, please don't hesitate to jump in. So here's a quotation from Michel Foucault's 1977-78 lectures at the Collège de France, where he talked on the subject of security, territory, population. Here Foucault is reflecting on the emergence of population as both a notion and a reality, so a concept and a reality in the writings of the 18th century mercantilists. He emphasizes the connection between knowledge production and the constitution of objects of knowledge. And with respect to population, knowledge of numbers of subjects, their age, their capacity to labor, and various other indicators help to condense, Foucault argues, this object into a specific reality. Population was not a phenomenon, moreover, Foucault argues, that could be controlled by decree. In a sense, this idea of population broke from the traditional sovereign subject dyad. Imagine a king giving a subject an order. Right? Foucault is saying, well, with the emergence of a population, this kind of power relation is no longer possible, or at least no longer so simple. According to Foucault, intervening to shape the population required acting on, quote, a range of factors and elements that seem far removed from the population itself, such as currency flows, export, import, as well as individualized desires to live and profit embodied in the supposed utility maximizing actor. So this understanding of population seemed to call forth for Foucault a very specific style of rule. I found this picture of Foucault on an Instagram site called Décrivant et Chat. So I just thought, I hadn't seen that one before, so I thought that it would be funny to put that one there. But in any case, let's think a little bit about work that uses Foucault to talk about surveillance of diseases. Inspired by these Foucauldian analyses of population, and of course a lot of other work that Foucault did on the birth of the clinic, on the emergence of various forms of knowledge and power. Inspired by all of this, work that emphasizes linkages between knowledge production about populations and the apparatuses of governance. A number of researchers have started to write about how population monitoring helps to make populations up, right, to constitute populations as objects of governance. David Armstrong's account of the rise of surveillance medicine, for example, argues that once the medical gaze was trained upon normal populations, illness began to inhabit a novel extracorporeal space. So illness began to inhabit this extracorporeal space, Armstrong says. For Armstrong, surveillance medicine calls into being a multifaceted population space that encompasses the physical gap between bodies. In rendering as problematic both the mass of bodies that makes up the so-called normal population and the extracorporeal space in between these bodies, surveillance medicine helped to reconfigure bodies and their relations as risky. So Armstrong is making an argument here about social relations coming into the consciousness of public health and medicalized forms of surveillance. Another thing that emerges, Armstrong argues, with surveillance medicine is this idea of the population as posing a kind of risk to itself, an internal, a certain kind of risk to itself coming from the inside. And Armstrong says this form of surveillance medicine helped to legitimate an anticipatory and interventionist style of governance. And this style of governance was characterized by an intensive monitoring of bodies and the spaces in between them. And so Armstrong's work, along with Foucault's, is very influential for my thinking about contemporary public health surveillance. I think it's useful for the way it theorizes the relationship between knowledge of populations and modes of governance. However, I want to suggest that contemporary developments in disease surveillance, and particularly those that are meant to leverage big data and social media infrastructures for participatory surveillance, a concept that I'll define in more detail a little further on. I want to suggest that these developments have perhaps less to do with the monitoring and making up of populations and more to do with the monitoring and making up of events. Now, this is not to say that populations have been displaced by events, nor that the population is no longer important. And it's not to say that Foucault's analytic insights cease to be relevant in the contemporary era. Rather, what I'd like to emphasize here is the uniqueness of this way of configuring public health problems. The focus on event detection seems to me to call forth novel kinds of governance brokered by big data and social media infrastructures, which are, I think, different from those called into being by modes of surveillance that are trained upon populations. Okay, so the trick here is to try and think the difference between a mode of surveillance trained upon a population and a mode of surveillance trained upon an event. I'm, of course, not making a claim about the novelty of my own work here. I'm not the only sociologist to remark on the significance of contemporary transformations in disease surveillance, nor this, maybe if you like, diminished focus on populations. Think of the work, for example, of Lorna Weir and Eric Mikulovsky, or of Carolyn Wraith and Neve Stevenson. I didn't have room to put his work on the slide, but Andrew Lakoff, an American anthropologist, has also written a lot about this stuff. I think all have discussed the nature and ramifications of these kinds of transformations in contemporary disease surveillance. But even though there's this work going on, I want to stress that I think there remains a great deal of scope for future research on public health surveillance and how it's being transformed by information technology, as well as the implications of these transformations for public health professionals, for public health organizations, and for the broader publics that these organizations serve. So there are a lot of really interesting transformations going on, and we need to, I think, as a researcher, I think I want to encourage discussion and critical thinking about it. And so that's what I'm going to present now is a framework for trying to think critically about some of the consequences or implications of these transformations. I want to start by arguing that the event is an active concept. So there are different ways of writing the genealogy of event detection in public health, and we could identify several important historical moments in the development of this discourse. And I don't have too much time to go into depth into this today, but I would refer you, if you're interested, to the work of Lorna Weir and Eric Mikulovsky in this book. I mean, it's a great kind of genealogical analysis of what they call global public health vigilance, the idea of public health emergency. It's bound up with, I think, this idea of event detection. What I want to focus on today is the event, if you like, of the 2005 International Health Regulations. So these are, right now, currently, the bundle of regulations that constitutes international law that governs for WHO, for World Health Organization member states, the requirements to provide surveillance of diseases in their territories. So it's a set of regulations that make up international law. One important thing to focus on is that when the IHR 2005 came into force, they replaced the IHR, so International Health Regulations, IHR. When these ones came into force in 2005, they replaced what had been in place since 1969, the IHR 1969. So in 2005, and recall that this was post, if you like, the scare of the first pandemic of the new millennium. This is post-2003, post-severe acute respiratory syndrome, right? A lot of effort takes place post-2003 to update these international health regulations with the idea that something like SARS could be spread so quickly around the world via networks of airline transportation. So when these come into force, they sort of change the playing field a little bit, because the 1969 IHR the way that the 1969 IHR worked is that they listed specific diseases and gave states responsibilities. So member states, you must develop surveillance systems to focus on cholera or other listed diseases. And if they weren't listed, arguably the member states had no obligation under international law to track these. And so what the IHR does, 2005 does, is it replaces these, this list. It replaces this list with the concept of a public health event, and we can sort of talk about exactly how it's defined, an event of international importance and so on. But I want to just highlight here the idea that the IHR 2005 really expanded the scope of international disease surveillance, okay? From a narrow sort of list of specific enumerated diseases to this idea of an event, right? The IHR, as Baker and Fiedler say in 2005, comes to encompass non-communicable disease events, whether naturally occurring, accidentally caused, or intentionally created. So this could be naturally occurring events related to a tsunami, related to an earthquake, intentionally created, this idea that we should have member states on guard for things like bioterror attacks, right? Think of post 9/11, the anthrax scare in the United States. So the IHR is written with all of these considerations in view. So the IHR expanded the purview of disease surveillance, and here's how the IHR defines an event. An event means a manifestation of disease or an occurrence that creates a potential for disease. And I just really want to highlight this term for you here, potential. Because I think it's interesting for thinking about in respect to developments that are taking place in digital epidemiology today. This idea of searching for a potential, right? An unrealized potential in an event. How do we identify that sort of thing? I think, moreover, as the slide says, that the concept of event here should be understood as an active concept. And following Lorna Weir and Eric Mikulovsky, what is an active concept? This is a concept that provokes, in their words, legal, political, and technological transformation. So this is a concept that organizes at the material level certain transformations. And just to say that, you know, through these IHR 2005 articles, we see a number of instances. Here are just a couple where they're foregrounding what the object of surveillance is. It's events, right? Report events, information. WHO shall collect information regarding events. So it's a concept that's very prominent in these documents, and in a way similar to the way that Armstrong talked about surveillance medicine. I think the event detection imagined by the IHR operates according to an anticipatory logic, right? How can we create a system of surveillance that will allow us to anticipate the unfolding of an outbreak before it becomes an international incident, right? How can we identify in a specific geographic region something that has the potential to escape its local containment, right? To become a sort of translocal phenomenon. If we can intervene early enough, quickly enough, right, we can contain it. So there's an anticipatory logic and a logic, I guess, also of containment that's at work here. Now, I want to suggest that this orientation of public health event detection implies a transformation in the forms of knowledge that public health organizations and professionals need. Indeed, I think in event monitoring, the search for potential here implies a need for a wider, algorithmically automated capacity and a different set of competencies that is than that which is typically found in what we might think of as shoe leather epidemiology. For example, shoe leather epidemiology, this is a term, I'm not sure if it was coined by Alexander Langmuir, but in any case, it's a term that this 20th century American epidemiologist who is very a very central figure in the establishment, in the creation of the field epidemiology program for the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. He talked a lot about shoe leather epidemiology. This was about, for him, doing work on the ground in local communities. It might be going door to door to gather data, to do contact tracing. The data here is collected specifically for the purpose of epidemiology, right? For the express purpose of understanding perhaps the incidence and prevalence of a given disease in that local population, okay? But with digital epidemiology, you're often not working with official epidemiological data sources. Instead, you might be data mining transactional data that is managed or held by a pharmacy. You might be mining Twitter or Facebook posts, searching for correlations that signal the beginning of an outbreak or other public health emergency. And these new data sources rely on a more complex information infrastructure, and the expertise required to develop and maintain such systems, I think, exceeds what we would typically find in the type of training that you might have received mid-20th century in a field epidemiology program. To illustrate, we can draw from Bolus and colleagues who provide a useful description of crowdsourcing and citizen sensing technologies which have been designed to help with public health surveillance and crisis management. And here I just want to draw your attention to this bubble on the bottom, which emphasizes the power of algorithms, okay? What these authors have in mind, right, is the increasing use of automated modes of sensing, sifting through large amounts of data, what they call feature extraction, clustering, and classification. Now, these authors shed light on some of the assumptions and forms of knowledge embedded into efforts to harness the wisdom of crowds. They argue that real-time mining of indirectly self-reported and surveillance information, surveillance as opposed to surveillance from below, okay, the idea of watching something from below as opposed to surveillance, watching something from above. These authors highlight the fact that all of this self-reported data, surveillance information, information from Twitter and other social networking feeds can offer useful data and insights about unfolding trends and emerging crowd behaviors at times of crises. And so I think this is really the promise, the opportunity that public health organizations and technologists are seeing, right, in this idea of crowdsourced surveillance. Yet you can see in this figure the emphasis of the power of algorithms. And the point that I want to make here is that the sociology of public health should be paying close attention to the implications of working with these new tools, right? How does this transform the everyday work practices of public health professionals? How does it transform the structure of public health organizations? What kinds of politics or decisions, if you like, are embedded into the algorithms themselves? Are they transparent? Who makes the algorithms? Is it a public health organization, or is it a privately held company that might have other interests that they want to embed into the construction of their algorithms? These new kinds of tools, I think, also create new kinds of problems. For example, if you get an automated alert about an outbreak of the flu, there is now a need to verify whether this is valid, right? So who does the verification? Have the machine-based algorithms, in other words, been correct in their identification of an event? How do we actually identify an event? What is the standard for determining the kind of action that needs to be taken when an event is identified in this way? And dealing with these new problems requires new kinds of expertise. In a minute or so, I'll invite you to think about the organizational tensions that might stem from the rise of these new forms of knowledge. But before I get there, let me say a few words about new data sources and what I've called with Eric Mikolovsky and Baki Shikuji, this idea of diverse informants. What we're after here with this idea is to try and think about the differences between, if you like, established modes of information flows and the population of the space of sensing and surveillance by all kinds of new people, if you like, citizens, but not just people. Think about diverse informants also as animals, right? Can we think of, in a way, about the non-human as an informant? Think about the algorithm as an informant. So that's theoretically what we're after here with this concept. But in any case, let me just kind of simplify and focus on, just the explosion of informants from diverse perspectives. Now, the idea here is that the concept of diverse informants is pointing to a qualitative and quantitative change in the nature of data that is used for disease surveillance. It's also pointing to a qualitative and quantitative change in the nature of data collection. So Eric Mikolovsky and Lorna Weir, in their discussion of the Global Public Health Intelligence Network, in an article they published in 2006, I believe, in the Canadian Journal of Public Health, they talk about this system, which is basically a system that was first designed by Health Canada. And one key feature of it was to crawl news websites for reports of disease activities or outbreaks. They characterize this as a shift from official sources of data to unofficial sources of data. For them, they say, here we have a transformation that's taking place, and we need to recognize the growing importance of unofficial sources of data. Now, of course, they say that public health professionals, people who are interested in public health have always relied on unofficial sources of data, whether it be word of mouth, whether it be informal or formal networks that they participate in, or even just reading the newspaper, right? But they say that the Global Public Health Intelligence Network represents kind of an intensification of this type of data. And their argument, and mine as well, is basically this idea, this effort to push disease surveillance into the realm of potentiality has occasioned the requirement of incorporating new sources of information. The problem, they say, that really emerges in the late 1990s for a lot of primarily American public health professionals is that established modes of surveillance are too slow, right? They don't work quickly enough. So there's a tremendous push that they document in their book towards achieving real-time surveillance, okay? And so it's no longer sufficient to rely on officially reported statistics which document lab-confirmed cases. This is too slow. So to get out in front of the event, what is required is a participatory sensor network. And here you can see an image from one of the more well-known participatory surveillance initiatives. This is called Flu Near You. And I'll just draw your attention down here to this. It's quite small, but there's a figure over here you can see. 332 cases or reports in red. So all of these red circles, there are 332 of them, more or less, on this map, of reports of what are called flu-like symptoms. Okay, so this is the idea that you're getting not lab-confirmed cases, but reports from diverse informants of flu-like symptoms. Citizens, probably the majority of whom are not epidemiologists, they're not doctors, can go and log on to flunearyou.org and report their symptoms. And so this creates a situation where professionals have to, they're getting this data, what do you do with it? Are these all cases of the flu? You know, are some of them hangovers? How do you kind of sort through, how do you parse that data? How do you make sense of this data? Here's another application called Sick Weather. Now, this company uses an algorithm. At one point on their website, they said it was patent pending, so I'm not sure. Maybe it's patented now. I'm not sure of the status of this. But in any case, it's a proprietary algorithm, right? Which means that I don't think we can, as a public, see, right, the nature of the algorithm. What is it kind of targeting? So this raises those kinds of transparency, political questions that I was mentioning earlier. So using this probably patented algorithm, the Sick Weather application crawls social media sites searching for posts like "I'm sick," "my son has chickenpox," etc. That's a quotation from their website. In addition, it also accepts direct user reports via mobile devices, and when, and I'm going to quote here, when several reports appear nearby each other at approximately the same time, they are grouped as a potential storm activity, represented by heat mapping. So this idea that illness in populations can be tracked in the same way as you know, the freezing rain that has come through Montreal. So I think that's kind of a fascinating way to think about forecasting, if you like, of illness in populations. Public health professionals, I was speaking with a public health professional last year who's an epidemiologist, and he was saying, you know what, we need to be thinking about nowcasting. We can't do forecasting. The best we can do is nowcasting, and we can't even do that very well. So in any case, there's a push, right, to get into the potentiality of the event more and more, so that you're anticipating the event. How do you do that? Technologically, practically, how do you do that? These questions are still being worked out, I think. Can you do that? That's another important question that is still being worked out. And there's a lot to say about applications like this, but as a touchstone for research, one thing I'd just like to emphasize is the type of subject that they imagine. In a few words, these are censor citizens who willingly share information about their state of well-being. And I think that's a kind of an interesting development and potentially a dilemma, right? To get people disclosing information about their well-being. Maybe with respect to flu, we would want to think about ethical issues connected to risks that people might take in terms of taking a day off work, reporting, you know, having that data correlated with what they reported on sick weather. Could this create difficulties for them? So, Foucault's discussion of the emergence of population as a phenomenon identifies a biopolitical rationality associated with demographic practices, wherein exposure of some individuals to life-threatening risks, for example, starvation, is recognized as a tolerable and even natural reality. This rationality holds that population is pertinent as the objective, and individuals, the series of individuals, are no longer pertinent as the objective, but simply as the instrument, relay, or condition for obtaining something at the level of population. So it's kind of a complex argument that he's making, if you like, about the subordination of individuals to this higher order phenomenon of population. So is what we have with contemporary public health, its focus on event detection via citizen sensor networks operating according to a similar rationality? I think that this is maybe an interesting question to explore. In the contemporary era, is the well-being of each sensor enrolled into the service of maintaining the well-being of a broader sensor network? Scholars like Andrew Lakoff, for example, have written critically about such developments, arguing that the preventative orientation ceases to be about stopping exposure, right? It's no longer about stopping exposure, but it's really about making populations prepared for exposure. So Lakoff has a big critique of preparedness discourse in public health, right? It's not about investing in those classic welfare state models of social solidarity, but instead it's investing in trying to recuperate and build resiliency against the disaster that will inevitably come. Let me turn briefly to discuss emergent organizational forms that are paired with participatory surveillance. There are many of these, but one I want to highlight for you has been the development of situation rooms and emergency management centers. I think images like this one recall Hollywood depictions. I don't know, think of Hollywood films like, I don't know, The Bourne Identity, for example, or any other kind of surveillance film where there's a command center and a whole bunch of people are working at lightning speed to quarterback surveillance operations, military policing surveillance operations. Now, adapted for the purpose of public health, situation rooms are meant to enable high, and I'm going to quote here from Bolus and colleagues, so these rooms are meant to enable high volume data feeds, including social media, to be processed and analyzed, such that participants in a response activity receive tailored data relevant just to their needs and roles. So the idea is that you've got a lot of people working here, combing through a lot of different information, right? Sources of information. The information is being analyzed, fused together, and it's being used to learn something about the event that has been detected so that the relevant decision makers can be informed about how to respond to that event. Borrowing from command and control imagery, Bolus and colleagues describe how in these spaces experts collect incoming data, process it, and communicate it in the best way possible to guide the act of decision makers. And I think in their work, I really like their work, but I think in their work it also, we also see an underlying assumption that events exist in some senses before the observation of them. Okay, and what this Foucauldian analytic frame is getting us to try and think about is how events and their observation co-produce the event. Right? So how this is producing, if you like, a specific kind of public health event. How this configuration is producing a specific kind of public health event. So I think a serious question for researchers to consider is how this particular configuration, this organizational form, the communications infrastructure, and participatory surveillance articulate together to make up health events. Let me try and say a few words now by way of conclusion about some of the wider implications of participatory surveillance for event detection. First, what are the wider implications of the event as an emergent active concept that provokes legal, political, and technical transformations in the context of disease surveillance? Although we can't say that event detection is replacing population monitoring per se, I think it's nonetheless worthwhile to observe that it implies a different modality of surveillance and governance and an emergent kind of politics. From this perspective, we should ask about the power arrangements implied by the rise of the event in public health monitoring and crisis management, as well as how these arrangements are technically organized and reorganized within these different versions, if you like, drawing from Jennifer Gabrus's work, versions of governance. The rise of the event can be read as a shift in the focus and means of public health monitoring and crisis management. Whereas once the population constituted the key object of observation, it may, within regimes of participatory surveillance, be comprehended as a key instrument for recognizing sudden and slow onset events. So there's a theoretical claim here, question about whether this is instrumentalizing the population in a specific way, right, to account for exposures as part of a sensor network. I'm not saying that it is, but it's something for public health organizations, professionals, technologists, sociologists, policymakers, and wider publics to think about. Right? What kinds of instrumentalizations are embedded into this shift to events? With respect to forms of knowledge, a decentering of the long-standing expertise of the shoe leather epidemiologist, I think, is well underway. Here, I think we would want to understand, in addition to how participatory surveillance may already complement existing forms of surveillance, we'd want to understand the tensions and torsions that it introduces, right? We often think of something like flu near you as just a bonus, something extra, a new tool for public health to use. But there may be a sense in which it also introduces tensions between established forms of knowledge and the kinds of disruptive forms of knowledge it is engendering. What types of conflicts might emerge between professions, for instance? Okay? How do we train epidemiologists today? Additionally, it seems to me that as these forms of participatory surveillance become more mainstream, public health professionals are going to have to become more computationally competent. But this is maybe a transformation in their traditional disciplinary knowledges. What sorts of traditional modes of competencies might they have to relinquish? What kinds of trade-offs are at work here? Okay? So do you spend time learning how to write an algorithm in your training, or learning about the history of harm reduction and working with marginalized communities if you're going door to door? Okay? So these are some. I'm not saying that these trade-offs are necessarily taking place, but are they taking place? We should ask. With respect to diverse informants, we can understand them as I think fundamentally necessary to the project of event detection. And according to the 2005 revision of the International Health Regulations, I think the focus on events represents a broadening of the scope of disease surveillance. And insofar as the project of public health monitoring has expanded, it makes sense that the network of actors capable of detecting events should also be broadened. But in a strange way, a wider implication of this broadening may be the decentering of individuals. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, but riffing on Foucault, if individuals are enrolled into a sensing network designed to detect events, is there a risk that they will become simply an instrument, a relay, a condition for obtaining information about events? Right, so this is again playing with Foucault's idea of the subordination of individuals to populations. From this perspective, we should ask about the types of actors and subjects that are imagined in relation to event-oriented public health monitoring and crisis management. Finally, what can be said about the various organizational initiatives underpinning contemporary discourse on public health, event detection, and crisis management? Here, I'd just like to, just again draw your attention to, this is from the CDC's website, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. Their emergency, the EOC, the CDC EOC, so the Emergency Operations Center of the CDC. I don't think it's always this busy, but it is staffed, they say, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. There's a lot of capacity A lot of public health, human resource capacity focused on event detection. So I'm not saying that this expenditure of public health resources is unwarranted, but we should, I think, be having a discussion about how this transformation of public health organizations is affecting the nature of service that they deliver to communities. I think it's important for sociologists and other stakeholders to investigate trade-offs between the kinds of emergency response expenditures and other forms of disease prevention tied, for instance, to so is there a trade-off, basically, between emergency preparedness, event detection on the one hand, and other forms of intervention, public health intervention that might be tied to longer-standing efforts to make communities resilient against things like poverty, for example, by providing access to care, a living wage, and so on. So I just want to conclude on that point. What trade-offs are at stake?